In this, we'll have a look at the different graphic settings in Battlefield 6, including how they impact the visual fidelity and performance of the game. We'll check the performance impact of each setting at every quality and recommend which settings you should lower depending on whether you're aiming for 60 FPS at 4K or 144 FPS at 1440p or 180 FPS at 1080p. Before we begin, here's a primer. The most taxing settings in Battlefield 6 include sun shadow quality. It works best at medium. And then there's screen space AO and GI. SSGI low and SSGI high are both quite taxing, cutting frame rates by up to 30%. And if you're CPU bound, like if you're aiming for 100 FPS and higher, you're most likely going to be CPU bound. While screen space GI is GPU intensive, it shouldn't be an issue if you're trying to reach higher frame rates over 100 FPS. High fidelity objects amount, and that is CPU intensive. You need to look out for that if you're aiming for high frame rates, 100 FPS plus. Sun shadow quality can also be CPU bound if you have a 6-core or 8-core CPU or an older CPU, old gen or Ryzen 5000, Ryzen 7000. Mesh quality is also quite CPU taxing at higher frame rates. And effects quality is just best left at low because it can greatly lower your 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile. Now GTAO high on the left and SSGI high on the right side. They both look very similar, but GTAO seems to be darker and more detailed. Performance-wise, SSGI is considerably slower. For outdoor scenes, the difference between the two, the visual difference is relatively minimal, with GTAO looking more detailed and darker and more intense. However, if you closely look at the vegetation, GTAO seems to be overshading the vegetation. SSGI adds a tint of sunlight color to these bushes while avoiding the overshading artifacts. This adds the colored light bounce effect to the scene. On the other hand, GTAO just evenly shades all the edges, corners, and crevices that are occluded, but this also leads to overshading quite often and doesn't include the colored light bounces that come with SSGI. Overall, SSGI looks better, but it's considerably slower, as we'll analyze in a bit. There's a comparison of SSGI low and SSGI high. Both look very similar, almost identical, but if you look in the distance, SSGI low sort of just drops out. It stops working at distant vegetation. That's because the ray marching steps are lower and the rays don't travel as farther. Also, if you look at the shadows on the trees and the bushes, high produces more darker and fuller shadows. This is because of the higher ray count at high. Here you can see the fall off for SSGI low. It doesn't cover distant geometry. And for all vegetation, for most, all the shadows at height are more detailed and higher resolution. Nonetheless, in combat, you are unlikely to notice this, so for all practical purposes, the differences are pretty much negligible. Have GTAO low versus GTAO high. So for nearby objects like these bushes here, difference is it's negligible. You can't tell them apart. But if you look closely, GTAO high avoids the overshading artifacts. They avoid it more often than GTAO low. The overshading is less intense. And for distant trees, everything is more detailed. At low, the quality falls off after a certain distance, but high maintains it most of the way. So that's the primary difference between GTAO low and high. Interestingly, the performance is almost the same. It's within 1%, so you can't really tell. Completely disabling GI and AO makes the vegetation sort of barren and two-dimensional. We highly recommend leaving at least GTAO low. It's barely slower than the offsetting and looks considerably better, especially when you're looking at vegetation and foliage. Wiggly illumination and ambient exclusion have a more profound impact indoors. Here we have GTAO high and SSGI high. There's a pretty sizable difference between the two. GTAO renders highly detailed shadows along edges, crevices, corners, and boundaries, while SSGI primarily emulates bounce lighting, color bleeding, and indirect diffuse lighting. Here you can see the primary difference. While GTAO renders highly quite prominent, dark, more intense corner edge shadows, SSGI focuses more on the color bleeding effect. The scene looks more vibrant but lacks more detailed ambient shadows. We did a more in-depth video on this. Be sure to check that out. SSGI low and SSGI high look almost identical in indoor scenes. The bedband difference can be seen in darker corners where SSGI high does a better job of slightly more illuminating than SSGI low, like this wall here. This is because of the fewer ray count at SSGI low compared to SSGI high. Without AO, the scene looks rather flat and dull without the ambient shadows. Here's a comparison of off versus GTAO low and GTAO high. You can see that GTAO also renders an approximation of the character self-shadow on the wall there. SSGI high is 20-25% slower than AO off. SSGI low is much more affordable, coming in at around 10-11% slower than AO off and 11% faster than SSGI high. GTAO high and low perform about the same and are only a couple of percent slower than AO off. For most people playing at under 100 FPS, we recommend GTAO high. But if you're aiming for 140 or 160 FPS, SSGI high might work well because in those scenarios, you're CPU bound, and SSGI mainly affects the GPU performance. However, if you have a lower-end 60 class card like the RTX 3060 or the 4060 or the 4060 Mobile, then it's best to stick to GTAO high or GTAO low. Next up, we have sun shadow quality. This affects the quality of shadows cast by the sun, moon, or any other global light sources. Here's a comparison of low, medium, high, ultra, and overkill. So the sun shadow quality adjusts the shadow resolution, that's the detail of the shadows. It also affects the shadow softness. At low, soft shadows are disabled and the shadows become sharper without a soft penumbra. It also adjusts the draw distance of shadows, the distance at which the shadows are culled. This impacts the CPU performance. So overall, sun shadows affect the CPU as well as the GPU performance. Lowest shadow quality preset low disables soft shadows, rendering rather sharp shadows with well-defined edges. The low quality sun shadows disable soft shadows, the shadow penumbra, rendering sharp, well-defined shadows. It also significantly reduces the draw distance of the shadows to just a few meters ahead of the player. Here you can see as soon as you sort of just move a few meters away from the shadows, they're culled. And then they pop in as soon as you start walking towards them again. Medium and high increase the draw distance of the shadows and also enable soft shadows. Medium slightly increases the draw distance, while high significantly increases the draw distance of shadows. This means that medium and high are going to be more CPU intensive than low, considerably more CPU intensive. So if you're CPU bound or if you're trying to hit 140, 160 FPS, reducing shadow quality to medium or low might help. Medium and low primarily differ with respect to the draw distance and the deep level of shadow softness. Medium is soft, has soft shadows, but not as soft as high. And high also has a considerably higher draw distance. You can see this in the form of the finer foliage and tree shadows in the distance. Ultra and overkill quality shadows further increase the draw distance, though it's not really noticeable over high. Furthermore, they continue to increase the penumbra width. The shadows become even softer. And lastly, ultra and overkill enable the finest quality shadows covering vegetation, foliage, grass, trees, and other finer geometry. Here you can see that overkill enables the vegetation shadows, the grass and trees in the distance. Ultra does it as well, but overkill further increases the quality of the grass and the vegetation shadows. Sun shadow quality is the second most taxing setting in Battlefield 6 after SSGI. Overkill is almost 20% slower than low. Ultra is 15% slower than low. High is 9% slower, and medium is only 2.5% slower than low. Now here, going from low to medium and high increases the GPU as well as the CPU load. So keep that in mind if you're going for higher refresh rates. Ultra and overkill primarily increase the shadow detail and increase the GPU load. Medium and high are the sweet spots for most people, but if you're aiming for 144 and 160 FPS, then you might want to stick to medium or perhaps even low if you can't hit your target. Local light and shadow quality adjusts the quality of shadows cast by artificial man-made light sources like bulbs and other electric sources. It primarily sets the draw distance of these shadows and has a negligible performance impact. You're better off just setting it to high or overkill because it barely impacts performance, although low can slightly reduce the CPU overhead, so it might be an option to consider if you're aiming for 160, 180 FPS. Up we have shadow filtering. This sets the method for filtering the soft shadows. You have PCSS, percentage closer soft shadows, and percentage closer filtering, PCF. Now, for the most part, they both look the same. There's pretty much no difference, and they perform the same as well, although we found PCSS to be very slightly faster on the RTX 4090. So the only small difference between PCSS and PCF is that PCSS makes the shadows more softer as you move farther away from the caster. For example, in this case, the guy's head shadow is slightly more softer, as it's the farthest using PCSS. The leg shadows are sharp, and the top head shadows, shoulder shadows get more softer with PCSS. PCF also the same, but it's less prominent. That's about it. Next up, we have screen space reflections. Like SSGI, this uses ray marching to render reflections of objects visible on screen on glossy surfaces. You can see the SSR screen space reflections in the puddles. Turning it off disables them, just leaving the pre-baked cube map chat reflections. Low and high mainly differ with respect to the reflection resolution. More rays at SSR high than low, which results in a slightly sharp, more clearer reflection. Either way, I recommend disabling them because they're often glitchy, they shimmer, and they're often aliased, and just they look ugly. Just it's best to disable them. And then there's reflection quality. This adjusts the resolution of pre-baked cube mapped reflections. These are, regardless of what's on the screen or off screen, they display the same image in puddles and glassy surfaces. High and low primarily change the resolution. Low looks kind of blurrier compared to high. Just looks like a blob, while high is much more clearer. Performance-wise, SSR screen space reflections high are about 4%, 3 to 4% slower than completely disabling screen space reflections. Low is like 2% faster than SSR low, than SSR high, and completely disabling it gives you a 4%. Which I recommend completely disabling screen space reflections. You get 4% boost, and you get rid of the shimmery aliased reflections. Now, the reflections, the pre-baked cube mapped reflections, they are just about 0.5% to 1% faster at low compared to high, but there is a noticeable difference in the 1% lows. The 1% lows are 4 to 5% higher at low compared to high. This implies higher CPU overhead at high compared to low. So you might want to consider lowering it if you're aiming for 160, 140 FPS, but I doubt it's much. It's pretty much just a couple of frames, even if you're CPU bound. Next up's high fidelity objects amount. Now, this won't really have an impact if you're running around 60 to 90 FPS, but if you're going over 100, like say 140, 160, 180 FPS, then this is very, very important. I'd suggest reducing it to low because it dramatically increases the CPU overhead. So what it does is that it sets the update interval for the soldier, vehicle, and other, moving things, the refresh rate for other moving things that are controlled by other players. Keep an eye on these guys, these soldiers here. Here we have low on the right side and high on the left. So at low, the legs just seem to bob around and flicker in and out. While high is much more smoother. This is mainly evident with the other players, your teammates, rivals, etc., and much less with vehicles, tanks, airplanes, and other war machines. I think it's best to just reduce it to low because it doesn't really matter how fluid the leg movement of your rivals is. Next up, we have lighting quality. this only comes with high and low. So it doesn't really do much. It just sets the intensity of artificial light sources. At high, they're brighter. At low, they're less bright. Now, indirectly, this affects the quality of volumetric effects, how prominent the volumetric light shafts and the God rays are going to be. High also results in a more thorough illumination of the atmosphere through the fog. Performance-wise, it's not noticeable. It's pretty much zero, so just stick to high. Next up, we have volumetric quality. Now, this adjusts the quality of the interaction of light with particle effects like fog, smoke, and smog. At higher quality settings, as light passes through fog and the other particle effects, its path will be more and more defined, which will result in sharper and more higher resolution God rays, volumetric rays, like here, while low results in pretty much you can't see the edges of the God rays, the volumetric rays. At high, you can slightly see the edge. It's a bit blurry, but it's still fairly defined. At ultra, it's the most defined. The same applies to the fog and smoke and all the other particle matter. At low, they'll just look like blobs without any definite shapes. At high and ultra, they'll look more defined as light passes through them and it illuminates the path of light. Performance-wise, this is kind of taxing. Volumetric quality is pretty taxing. Low is 9% faster than ultra and 6% faster than high. For most people aiming for 120, 140 FPS, I'd say go with high, because since this is GPU bound, it's not gonna impede your race to the top. So, but if you're already GPU bound, if you're trying to hit 70, 80 FPS and are struggling with that, then drop it down to low, because then you're GPU bound probably. Effect setting is another graphics quality setting that drastically increases the CPU overhead during explosions, collisions, and other finer particle effects. Here we have effects quality at high on the left and effects quality at low on the right side. While the difference between the two is minimal, mainly high mainly increases the number of particles, embers, debris, and other related particles during explosions and other explosive effects. But the differences are fairly minimal. Most people won't even notice them. What you do notice is the frame rate impact. High is 6 to 8% slower than low during explosions, collisions, and other combat-intensive effects. We recommend everyone to set this to low, as you barely lose any fidelity and you gain a sizable improvement in your 1 percentile. Undergrowth quality and terrain quality both have a negligible impact on performance. Undergrowth sets the density of ground foliage, shrubs, and other plantations. Terrain sets the quality of terrain mapping using techniques like bump mapping, parallax mapping, and tessellation. Here's how terrain mapping, terrain quality affects fidelity. On the left, we have terrain low, and on the right, we have terrain max. So max mainly just uses parallax mapping and tessellation to sort of just create fake detail out of flat geometry. The performance impact is minimal, a couple of frames at best. So yeah, I recommend just leaving it at the highest quality. Mesh quality sets the polygon complexity, the geometric complexity of various objects in the scene. This affects the distance at which high-quality assets, high-quality meshes are replaced by low-quality alternatives to save performance. This also means lower quality settings mean increased pop-ins as you shift from high quality to low quality assets and vice versa. If you're averaging 60 to 80 FPS, then this is gonna have a pretty much negligible impact on your performance. This is much more important for CPU-bound scenarios if you're aiming for 120, 140, or 160 FPS. Higher quality meshes mean more triangles and more CPU draw calls, which increases the CPU load and the overhead. So you want to reduce this to as low as possible to attain those high 160, 180 frame rates. The primary difference is with respect to the level of detail for various objects in the scene. At lower quality settings, a lot of the finer geometry will be replaced by low fidelity assets, and there'll be many of the objects in the distance will look flatter and more two-dimensional. At higher quality settings, he'll be using higher quality assets for most of the objects in the scene. And lastly, we have texture filtering and texture quality. Texture filtering barely has an impact on performance and can really smoothen out blurry textures that are sort of perpendicular to your screen. I recommend sticking to Ultra or Overkill. Doesn't really make much of a difference in performance and can smoothen out the blurry textures. For texture quality, 8GB cards should stick to Ultra at 1080p, but if you're using FrameGen at 1080p, it's best to stick to high. 1440p, all 8GB cards high, regardless of whether you're using FrameGen or not. 12GB cards and 16GB cards can easily use Overkill. We observed something interesting with upscaling and lighting. Just direct lighting though, not indirect diffuse lighting. So DLSS seems to retain considerably more lighting detail than TAA and FSR. Notice the glare on the chair and the vegetation. DLSS on the left and TAA on the right. As you can see, DLSS retains significantly more lighting data all across the scene. FSR fails to do so much like TAA and loses all the lighting data and looks much worse when it comes to geometric complexity. There's a significant loss in detail, and lighting data isn't retained either. That said, FSR is 10 to 15% faster than DLSS at every quality preset.